Hello everyone, it's Rose, and I'm here with a couple of exciting announcements and a little bit of sort of like in the weeds explanation for some of the changes that are happening within the Flash Forward universe. I am making this as a video. There will also be a blog post on flashforwardpod.com. So if you would prefer to like read about this as opposed to listen to me talk about it on a video, you can go do that now. You do not have to watch this whole thing. But some people seem to like the videos, and also I am trying to learn how to get better at making videos. So we're just gonna we're gonna get there together. This is like a little practice round. So, exciting things. Some really exciting things. Today launches the first Flash Forward spin-off podcast called Advice for and from the Future. It is sort of what it sounds like. It's an advice show for and from the future. And I put the logo up back here, but I'm realizing now that it's maybe backwards. But whatever. You can find it. I'll link to it in the notes for the video and stuff like that. And I'm excited about that. Basically, the genesis of that, which you'll hear about if you listen to the podcast this week, it's in the Flash Forward feed and its own feed. But the genesis for this show is basically that I get a lot of questions from listeners that ask me for advice, and I try to respond to all of them as best I can individually, but those questions often sort of cluster around similar topics and similar questions. So I thought it would be really good and fun to make a show to address those questions, and more efficient also. So Advice for and from the Future is going to be sort of a similar ethos to Flash Forward, really thinking about how to think about the future and prepare for the future and be ready for it. But it's a little bit more wacky, I would say. It's a little bit more loose and fun. It's also a little bit more adult. There will be cursing. We'll probably talk about sex. And it's just going to be like a little bit more of a wild card show. So the beginning of every episode of that show is going to be an interview with someone about the question, and then at the end of every episode is a little wild card coda that I'm excited for you to hear because they are weird and fun and I'm having a good time with them. Okay, so that is exciting announcement number one. Exciting announcement number two is that I have launched a sort of production house to house all of these projects. So Flash Forward, Advice for and from the Future, and then also future projects that I have in my brain, and many of which are sort of in production and in sort of various stages of being created. So Flash Forward Presents, which you can see again the logo for right there, even though I think it's going to be backwards on the screen, is basically, an overarching production company, set of shows, suite of shows, if you will, that are all kind of trying to advance the same project, same idea, this idea of thinking about the future and trying to get people ready for what's to come. So it will house Flash Forward, it will house Advice for and from the Future. Third thing, within Flash Forward Presents, there is now sort of a new-ish financial model for this bigger overarching project. So as you may know, Flash Forward, the podcast, has a Patreon page, and it has really sustained the show for over 5 years now. The Patreon page is amazing. I love every single individual patron. The way that the Patreon page is set up is to be per episode of the show. So you sign up to donate, and you donate a certain dollar number for every episode that goes out. And that works great for the podcast. It's totally functional. Most Patreon pages these days are not set up to be like that. Most Patreon pages these days are set up to be per month. So per item versus per unit of time is kind of the distinction. And Patreon has sort of advised most of its creators, including me, to try and switch over to the monthly model, which makes complete sense because, that means that even if you're working on the show, like for me, if I'm working on Flash Forward, but the show isn't coming out, we always do a break in between seasons. So there are months in which I'm working really hard on the show, but I'm not actually making any money doing that because there aren't episodes coming out, so Patreon isn't, charging people. So Patreon would generally like for most people to switch over to monthly, and I've thought about doing that, but there's a big but here. Flash Forward is 20 episodes per year. There are, as you probably know, 12 months in a year. So going from, and Patreon is not going to change anybody's pledge for them, which makes complete sense. So if I were to switch the Flash Forward Patreon to be per month to potentially kind of help fund some of these other projects, or just sort of be a little bit more in line with what Patreon is sort of trying to do, I would wind up cutting my income pretty severely per year. So going from 20 times whatever the Patreon amount is to 12 times. So that's like a pretty big cut. I did a poll of my patrons and asked them, hey, you know, would you increase your pledge to be the same amount of money per year? Like you would be giving the same amount of money per year, but in order to kind of match that 20 to 12 cut, you'd have to kind of increase your pledge amount by some number. And many people said basically like, in theory, yes, I would, but I'd probably forget, or like, I don't really understand, or there was enough sort of uncertainty and enough people who didn't think they would actually do it, that it just doesn't feel like it's worth the risk to me to do that. And also, you know, the per episode model for Flash Forward for my particular use case on Patreon is working just fine. So I'm leaving that the way it is. So when I start to think about Flash Forward Presents and these other projects like the Advice Show, like these other shows I'm working on, there was this big question I had of like, how do I fund those things? Now, some of those things I will eventually be able to sell to either a network, sell a book, sell, you know, a TV show, whatever it is that I'm working on. But, you know, getting that stuff started obviously takes a lot of time, and, you know, this is my job, right? This is how I make my money. So I could have done a couple things. Assuming that I was going to keep Flash Forward as a per episode Patreon, I could have done something like starting to charge people for advice episodes, which does not feel like the right thing to do, because obviously that's not what you signed up for. That's not what you signed up to donate to. It's a different show. It's going to be a little different. The audience will obviously overlap in some situations, but it's not going to be a one-to-one exact match. Some people might like the Advice Show and not really like Flash Forward, or vice versa. So charging people for something they didn't sign up for that they might not even want did not feel good to me. It would also mean suddenly charging people double the number of episodes that they signed up for or that they thought they were going to be paying for. So that felt obviously like not something to do. I could have made a new Patreon for just the Advice Show, but then I was sort of thinking about all of these other projects that I have, and I don't want to be in the business of running like 9 different Patreons at one time. It just seems like too much. I could have started a new tier within the Flash Forward Patreon page for people who just want to support the Advice Show and be like, okay, and then have different tiers for each project, and that sounds really confusing. And like, what if you want to support both? Like, and you kind of can't. It's just like, bleh. That sounds very confusing. So I'm not doing any of those things. What I am doing instead is that I'm launching a membership program through Memberful for Flash Forward Presents. So if you want to kind of get more behind the scenes on the sort of broader project that I'm working on, the broader kind of, I hate to say like the Rose Eveleth show or like the Rose Eveleth project, but that's like sort of what it is. If you are interested in supporting both Flash Forward and the Advice Show and then any of these other future experiments, Flash Forward Presents is what that's for. And there's a membership program now for Flash Forward Presents that is now active, so you can become a time traveler, is what I'm calling it, and it gets you everything that you would get from the highest tier of the Flash Forward Patreon page, and also behind the scenes stuff from these other projects, writing prompts from the future, a special newsletter, a bonus podcast, like all of this other stuff that is connected to these other projects. So that's it. Those are the big announcements. I really want to thank everybody who's like sort of helped me walk through a lot of this and think through a lot of this, particularly patrons of Flash Forward. I posted about all of this. This is not news to any of you if you're a patron, in a couple of posts and on the bonus podcast. And people gave really good feedback, asked really good questions. Huge thank you to Liz Neely also, who like helped me think through a lot of this. And thank you to everybody who suggested that I charge more than I was originally planning on charging for the membership program. I have a tendency to often undervalue what I'm offering and be like, oh, no one's gonna pay that much. But I hope people do. And again, like if you just want to support Flash Forward, the podcast, the Patreon page for the podcast is great. That is not going anywhere. That will not be, I'm not planning on retiring that in favor of this anytime soon. That's not part of the plan. They're just sort of parallel tracks. And again, like you should never feel like you need to support both. If you become a time traveler, a member of the Flash Forward Presents project, you get everything you would get on Patreon. And if you just want to stick with Flash Forward because that's a show you like, that's great. That's not going away. None of your rewards will change. Everything will stay the same for you. So that's that. I made a video. What am I forgetting? Bye. Remote. I got a remote to turn it on and off.